Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Curious Mindset. I'm not Bandish. I'm Bryony. I look after the community and the curation here at the Curious Mindset. Usually you would hear from Bandish at this point, but I'm stepping in today to welcome you all. For those of you who are new to Curious Mindset, this is an invite-only community for technology leadership teams powered by 64 Tech. While 64 Tech supports the platform, the real value here comes from the people in the room. As technology leaders, you are often expected to move faster and decide with less information. In the noise of firefighting and strategy decks, the time to work through real human challenges of leadership can easily disappear. That's why we built the community. Curious Mindset exists for honest conversations with people who offer perspectives or experience. There are no membership fees and no sales pitches, just a space to think clearly and to grow. This organization did not come from a textbook. It grew out of the real mistakes and hard lessons learned while building 64 Tech over the last 13 years. We learned that leadership is not about having all the answers, it's about having the right people around you when the pressure is high. Our mantra is simple: together we grow. We're building a community where you do not have to figure it out alone. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to our host, Andy McMenemy, our resident technology leader, and co-host Steve Maxwell, and our very special guest, Stephen E. Morris. I now need to do the thing. You're back again. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. No worries. So, yes, thank you so much, Bryony, for handling the introduction. Whilst we're missing Bandish in person, he's absolutely here in spirit. In fact, none of us would be here without Bandish's spirit and his entrepreneurial vision for the Curious Mindset, because it's down to Bandish's generosity through 64 Tech using their marketing budget to put this whole community together and to fund it so that we can all get together every 2 weeks in the Curious Mindset sessions. So that generosity is absolutely making a difference in people's lives. We know that from the feedback, and I'm absolutely delighted to be the host again this week. Today, we have a returning guest. We have Stephen E. Morris joining us for another session. Stephen is a leadership strategist, an advisor with a background in technology, in defense, in public sector as well. He's also an author, and in the last session we had with Stephen, his book, Leaders, Believers, and Expert Deceivers, formed the backbone of that session. And the communications and the conversations that continued after Stephen's session went on for quite a significant amount of time. So it was incredibly valuable. And today, Stephen is going to be exploring the idea that some of the biggest influences on leadership success are the ones that we can't easily see. And it's wrapped up in something that Stephen calls organizational dark matter. So as I bring Stephen E. Morris into the community, can we all welcome him warmly for his return visit to the Curious Mindset? Stephen, good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you, Bryony. And at a distance to Bandish, I'm delighted to be brought back. Just a note, because I noticed both Bryony and yourself respected. That's the wrong word entirely. The E in Stephen E. Morris. That's not because I'm pretentious, but rather, if you Google Stephen Morris, you get the drummer from Joy Division. So it was a way of trying to kind of find myself. I'm honestly just Stephen. I don't need to be any more than that at any other point. But thank you so much, Andy, and for everybody, the Curious Mindset, for bringing me back.
Well, it's great to see you, Stephen. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I'm very curious about this organizational dark matter subject. So why don't you take it away?
Sure. So I'll just briefly explain a bit where this kind of came from, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. So when I was researching and working on the previous book, I touched on and talked quite often actually about the idea of context being important. And one of the core conclusions that I reached was that context was pretty much always going to be more important than doctrine. You know, the simple examples of things like if your building's burning down, you want sort of an autocratic fireman to tell you what to do rather than to sit around and chat about what kind of flavor ice cream you like and that sort of stuff. You know, we intrinsically understand that context is important. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. since then, I've been trying to think about it, because I did mention in the book some work by a guy called Naresh Agarwal, who he did one of those sort of systemic reviews, going through pages and pages and pages of stuff to come out with this list of different types of context. And in his list, he had 15, and I've ended up at the moment with 15, although they're slightly different. And I thought in itself that was kind of something quite curious. So I got to that point through a bit of a philosophical journey, I suppose is the easiest way to describe it. And I was thinking about how best to share that. And it's probably best described through three perspectives, or through three authors, I think, that kind of help you get to where I am. So the first one was a lady called Brenda Dervin, who was a communications theorist in the US. She's one of the originators of all things sense making anyway. So I'm glad to list all these names out at the end anyway, but Brenda's certainly somebody to look up. But she spent her time trying to understand how individuals interpret and make sense of the world. Basically, if you can do that, then you can communicate much better, because you've got a much more of a sense of the other person on the other side, as it were. So one of the key things she was talking about was the sort of history of how information is used. So if you think of early in Western philosophy, we had this sort of idea that information described some sort of ordered reality, whether that's religion, like the commandments in Christianity, for example, even Newton's laws of motion, but it's sort of a fixed idea. We've more recently moved on to the idea that reality isn't always very ordered, and sometimes there are some chaotic elements of it. And different people have had attempts to kind of harness that, I suppose, or understand that. I'm thinking of people like Dana Meadows, one of the sort of originators or proponents for systems thinking, for example, that idea that you can sort of map what's going on in an environment and therefore understand better the causes for results for relationships and so on. My reading of a lot of that stuff has been that there's still the sort of an unspoken assumption that those maps capture enough of reality to be accurate. So maybe you're an extension of, rather. Where Dervin ended up, though, her third sort of level of information was this idea that information is purely a human construct that we use to make sense of the world, both ordered and chaotic, around us. So every single individual builds their own sense of the world and how that works. And I would guarantee everyone on the call has had that experience where you're talking about something with someone and you realize suddenly that the person you're speaking to has an entirely different perspective on what you're talking about. And that's sort of that. A quick example of that would be a slightly emotive word like communism, for example. If you do a word association with communism to someone who's a Marxist, they're going to talk about things like emancipation, the class struggle, things like equality and so on. But if you do the same thing to sort of a very much sort of a libertarian right-aligned person, they're going to say state control, economic failure, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. But Dervin's main point was both of those perspectives, that's the shape of how those people are interpreting their world. So that Brenda's sort of my first point of call, really, that context that shapes our worldview. Then the next person I'll mention is Robert Sapolsky. If you haven't met, oh yeah, that's fine. You've met Robert Sapolsky already. Big smile. So for those who haven't met Robert Sapolsky's work, he's a neuroscientist and spent many years as a primatologist. His lectures are well worth seeing. They're all available on YouTube, or many at Stanford. His broad idea is, or his point really, is that is how a person behaves. He was interested in, so what causes the behavior? And his conclusion broadly is, to use his analogy, is that it's turtles all the way down. So that is, if I perform an action now, milliseconds before I perform the action, a neuron in my mind or in my brain has somehow fired a muscle to move and so on. But there's a neuron behind that. And then there's a hormonal mix in my brain in the last few minutes, how much caffeine I've got in my system, what I had for lunch. Did somebody cut me up on the motorway this morning? And it goes back, turtles all the way down in his case, drops right the way through to your childhood, your treatment, your prenatal conditions, as well as, of course, back to your own genetics and evolution itself, leading up to a point. His conclusion from that is actually that there is no such thing as free will, because any other person put in the same circumstances would do exactly the same thing. But regardless of how you look at it, there's huge complexity in the origins of our behavior. It might be worth just quickly giving you an example of that, because one of his favorite examples, if you don't mind me sharing.
Yeah.
It's not a very nice thing, but I think it's a good description of how futile some of our controller behavior is, which is an example that came from a famine in Holland at the end of the Second World War. So 1944-45, there was a period of famine, partly because of a German embargo and a railway strike by the Dutch themselves as well. Anyway, but there was this group of people that were forced to famine. The thing that was very curious was the survivors of that had been followed, and prenatal exposure to that famine had long-lasting effects on the people involved, all sorts of different rates of disease and so on. One particular very curious one was that a baby in utero during that period had a much higher chance of having problems with obesity later in life. And the connection effectively is, and Robert Sapolsky almost describes it like this in one of his videos, so I'll take his lead on this, that it was like the unborn baby effectively looked outside, checked on what the world was going to be like out there, and decided, set the switches to be, we need to think about calories. The net effect as they grew up, though, was that their metabolism somehow was affected in a way that they took more calories on for the food that they were eating and had trouble keeping the weight off. Fascinatingly, again, those people who then went on to have children themselves, their children had an echo of the same behavior. So when one of the women who had that trait, as it were, passed, then had a child in utero, we had the same thing where the fetus didn't receive quite as much nutrition, set the switches in a similar way, and then ended up again with problems with obesity. That was perhaps longer than I expected, Andy. Sorry.
No, fine.
The point I was making in there was that I love that example, just to describe almost the futility somehow of trying to do something. The cards are absolutely stacked by something miles out of your control, and that's influencing your behavior right now. I'll move on to the third one and then briefly about the context, and I'll be quiet for a second. But if understanding of that context can then help us to understand and behave, or understand why we behave as we do, then the third person that I bring in is Ian McGilchrist. So he's a psychiatrist, philosopher, neuroscientist, has written probably some of the most accessible but deeply difficult books I think I've ever read. Most of what he writes about or what I've read about at least, is the relationship between the left and the right brain, or the left and the right hemispheres of our brain, rather than suggesting we've got two, and how they shape our reality. I think we've broadly got this understanding already that our left brain our left hemisphere is this sort of data-oriented, parroting, memorizing facts kind of center, follows rigid curricula, if you like. And then the right hemisphere is more about experiential learning and integration of knowledge, comfort with ambiguity, that sort of thing. The point that he makes in his latest book is effectively that most of our Western societies have been designed around this left hemisphere thinking of, if we can control it, we can manage it, we can organize it, and then that's the right thing to do. And we diminish the other part of our intuition and our understanding of the world around us. An example, if you think about a school, for example, the way that we approach schooling is that sort of watching my teenager at the moment, he's being asked to parrot facts. He isn't invited to understand how subject A interferes with subject B, with subject C, and so on. It's all very discrete and kind of mechanistic, if you like. McGill's point, though, is that you need this sort of balance of both sides in order to genuinely, truly understand things. And that echoes a bit back to what I was talking about last time in terms of sense making and so on. Mm. So all of those three things, how individuals interpret the world through Dervin, why they do through Sapolsky, and then how our brains shape reality, kind of, that's the sort of foundation, if you like, that led me to this idea that there are, or this listing of these contexts that impact. Perhaps rather than go through all the 15, because that's going to be incredibly dry for everybody on the call anyway, let alone me. If you just imagine a scenario of, let's imagine that we're in a courtroom for a midday trial, okay? And we've got the judge, there's just a judge presiding, no jury, and they've got their full wig on. You know, it's a very formal affair, wood panels, that sort of thing. You've got the scene, sort of an idea. Then that provides some context already, but that's the sort of context of setting. That's quite obvious, if you like. We've got some visibility of some other contexts in that room too, things like constraints in the form of laws, let's say, or at least our understanding of what specific roles people are playing in the courtroom. The thing is, there are other contexts at play. For example, we would never be able to understand the level of the defendant's propensity to lie. For example, you know, I'm not a grass, for example. You wouldn't be able to ever define that, let alone their understanding or desire of their understanding of rights and their desire to exercise them. And then, of course, from various studies that happened in the US not that long ago, looking at parole hearings, we know that a judge that's hungry is more likely to give a bad result to a parole hearing. So if you're ever up on trial, go straight after breakfast or straight after lunch. But even then, if we understand that, we can't know just how much that affects this particular judge this particular day based on all of the other sort of stuff. So the conclusion that I've reached really is that there's just this entanglement of stuff that for at least everything I've read, I can't get away from. A long intro, Andy, but hopefully that starts to sketch the picture of why I think context is worth exploring more.
Absolutely. And my mind's racing all the time as you're talking about that. One of the things that came up for me was a quote by Carl Jung that said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. And I guess the juxtaposition for this then is that, you know, leadership doesn't fail often as a result of lack of effort or lack of knowledge, but more by lack of awareness for what's going on that we're not conscious of, we're not aware of in the organization. And that can be a plethora of things. And we spoke a little bit in the introduction about a word called entropy, which is that decay of energy and anything's natural propensity over time to decay. And I guess from a leadership perspective, Stephen, if we're not aware of these, you know, invisible forces that are going on, there isn't much chance of being able to manage and control it, right?
No, I think that's I think that's perhaps similar to where I started before I dived into a lot of this stuff. Okay. I don't mean to challenge you on that, or not in quite the way that I just did. Sorry, it sounded rather passive aggressive. I didn't mean to. The thing is, it's the idea that if you can make unconscious things conscious, you've got more chance of controlling them. I agree with that. You know, making things visible is absolutely what I love to do with individuals and teams and so on. It's just discover some of this stuff. The conclusion really that I've reached through a lot of this research, though, is that there's a layer that you just don't see at all ever. Okay. So it's not even so much that it's unconscious, it's invisible entirely. So that's actually, because I haven't talked about that, but that's how I came to the title, or this sort of the title for this talk, and that sort of paradigm. So many times in things, change management seems to like this quite a lot. This idea of an iceberg model, where when you're looking at a project or a change and whatever, you've got the stuff on top that obviously you can see and you can do something about. In my language, that's the setting, that sort of stuff that I'm just talking about, like the courtroom I just said. But then there's this underneath as well, which is this dark stuff, or this or not necessarily invisible stuff. Sorry, I'm correcting myself. That's the stuff that is unconscious, as it were, that you can, with some effort, make conscious and therefore interact with and operate. If we can just afford enough submarines, we'll know exactly what's going on, and we can avoid the thing entirely. But that is fine, but that never explains, for me, that never explains the hungry judge kind of situation where you've got we briefly spoke before, that idea that someone said that they didn't like my shoes when I came into the office, and that's tainted how I interact with that person. But I'm probably not even aware at a conscious level. There's no obvious moment, or at least a way of quantifying what the impact of that is. So this, I suppose, is the core of the invitation for this session here to the people on the thing, is rather than to think about an organization as this iceberg where we've got visible stuff and stuff that we've just got to work harder to find out about. I think dark matter works as a better metaphor, really. So in our universe, using that, we've got things which are, as it were, in the light, things that we can see, we can observe, we're very comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Like the bottom of the iceberg, we've got things in the shade too, but according to our understanding of the universe, there is a big chunk of stuff which is missing, but which we don't know what it is. But without it, our equations, as it were, don't work. If based on observations, all of our gravitational calculations are kind of wrong unless we put this dark matter stuff in. The universe isn't expanding and accelerating the way it does unless it's not dark matter, it's dark energy, but unless we've got this invisible component again in that picture. And I think that's true in organizations, hence the kind of analogy that sure, we've got those two things, but the context of, say, luck or chaos that happens, unfortunately, once you see it once, you see it a lot, where someone will claim that they were an amazing leader at a point in time because they came up with this amazing thing, or they did this decision. My favorite was a fairly recent one, of someone saying that they'd managed to dramatically change the culture because they changed the dress code policy. Effectively, it was the suggestion was it was quite a stiff organization, and they got everybody in jeans and t-shirts, and then suddenly overnight everything was wonderful. But that is a very reductionist view for a start. But as you start to think about how organizations and how people work, the fact that we've got every single one of the members of those team coming through their own personal journey into that, to suggest that that was the reason why it happened, no idea at all. As I said to I said in chat, actually, at that thing, was maybe the only reason that they relaxed the dress code policy was because someone asked them to marry them that morning, and it put them in a good mood. In which case, how much ownership can they really claim of that decision and that final outcome? In the end, unfortunately, I think probably a little bit less. So I think for me, and where I've got to with that, is that's in a sense quite liberating, because sure, there's going to be stuff which I can understand and stuff that I unconscious stuff that I may be able to pull out. But if we take that sort of the physics model a little bit further too, we've never seen an electron. We've never seen any of these small particles. Oddly enough, an electron microscope is too big to see an electron. Who'd have thought? Can't see something with that anyway. But we know they're there because of the impact that they have on other things. And I think that maybe is a little bit of a liberating thing, in a way, that we can maybe set ourselves up to detect the effects of these things rather than explicitly be able to influence them.
And that was going to be my question. So if we take it back into our business lives, our business worlds, our management of teams as tech leaders, what can we do to influence, or what can we do to identify, I guess, some of these invisible forces that you feel may be causing us not to succeed sometimes?
So I probably two headlines, I think, maybe to start with. One is, which is something I'd advocate anyway, which is a sort of general sense making in organizations anyhow. Sense making just comes under this broad banner of, well, like I said at the start with Dervin, talking about how people make sense, but being able to explore that with other people, then maybe you give yourself a chance of those sort of water cooler moments, as it were, that chance of discovering that an assumption that's being made over here definitely wouldn't fly over here. Mm-hmm. And there are loads and loads and loads of different tools that are out there that do that, from the names I've been talking about already. Many people on the call would have done something with Dave Snowden, for example, with his tools, which encourage that sort of open thinking, Gary Klein, people like that. But actively, I suppose, what I'm trying to get to is actively you can use tools like those, even, De Bono's 6 thinking hats and so on, that maybe provide a little bit of additional they provide an opportunity to expose some of that stuff. I suppose maybe you're never going to expose the luck stuff that I'm talking about, but perhaps if you set yourself up to be prone to the idea that it might happen, then I think that's positively, genuinely a positive thing to do. In my teams that I've worked with over the years, I've never regretted doing a sort of, wouldn't it be interesting to know type session. Whether that be, people drawing pictures of what they think this project looks like, something as airy as that, all through to doing pre-mortems and all this sort of other stuff. But chances for people to talk to each other without there needing to be an absolute outcome almost always comes up with something interesting. Probably more practically than that, or at least maybe as an extension to that, and if I can stick with the physics metaphors for a second, is kind of think about a project or something like that, but rather than monitor a set of targets or metrics as we perhaps normally do, the time cost quality triangle is informative, sure, but that's the top of the iceberg for what's going on. Perhaps the way that we understand what happens in a collision when we smash these two protons together in the Hadron Collider in CERN, we don't just have one thing there looking for one particular outcome. We've got an array of detectors that are curious, almost. I'm giving them sort of, I'm anthropomorphizing the detector, but you've got things that look for different things, and then the physicists there then spend time understanding those results, but talking about those results and what they might mean. So it provides implications, let's say. So in a project, you could, for example, have something like the hard metrics, your time, like I say, your time cost quality stuff. Someone definitely needs to be checking and monitoring a budget, but you might also have a layer which is capturing micro narratives. So small stories about what's happening from your client's perspective or from your teams. We're bringing that data in. We might have the CIO has a Friday breakfast with members of the team, just to go and have breakfast and have a chat, no agenda, just as an opportunity to maybe hear something. That actually works very well if you take dyads or triads, teams of 2 and teams of 3 that are just asked to regularly have a cup of coffee with each other from different parts of a project, and then just see what comes up out of the other side of it. So another layer might be more active sense making, like doing something with one of the Snowden tools or otherwise, but it's all about giving yourself an opportunity. That's really what I'm talking about. You definitely won't see it all, but you're more likely to, I suppose. You're not likely to at all if you don't do anything. Sorry, that's a tautology, I suppose. But those weak kind of signals, I think, you're not going to see those if you don't believe they exist in the first place.
And I guess where my mind was going when you were explaining about the CTO having breakfast, it's that unspoken effect of their personal energy in a triad or dyad. The presence itself kind of changes what would have happened if they hadn't been there, right? And so there's an influence from being associated with the CTO or sitting and spending time with the CTO in that kind of environment with no agenda, just at breakfast. There's a, I often remember in leadership for me, I always remembered when I walked away from a scenario like that, sitting down with someone having breakfast with no agenda, and they were sharing insight with me. I often felt much better as I walked away about myself than I had done before I sat with them, if that makes sense. So they had this ability to inspire or to infect me with their energy, if that makes sense. It kind of rubbed off on me. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that correctly in the same context here, but I guess it's an invisible force, isn't it?
Yeah. I I try not to make this in a sort of a physics lecture entirely, because you're sort of starting to talk about a bit about Heisenberg here and the observer effect and so on. Because the very act of looking is changing the result that comes out of the other side. But back that's the sort of bit that I've been wrestling with. It's perhaps the wrong word, but thinking about and thinking about more, because a context of, I talked about the context of constraints earlier. So we know that there are constraints which are definitely in the light. These things that are organizational rules, laws, all that sort of stuff. That's the obvious stuff, maybe. Maybe there's some dark stuff some stuff in the shade that we can pick up on. Technical design constraints that we just forgot to ask, an architect over there what we were allowed to do and weren't able to do, or we did something that was going to upset NIST or something, so we better not do that. We'll do whatever. But then you've also got sort of the constraints around things like power dynamics and so on. So in the scenario that you just described there, you're absolutely right. There's if you've got a senior person talking to someone lower, as it were, hierarchically in an organization, it's going to be impossible to know how open and how visible that conversation is. How the times I've seen that work is when it's done regularly and repeatedly, so that it doesn't feel quite so alien in an organization. Things like, where you've got I did this in a company years ago where I just had the door open to a room and I was there for an hour every Wednesday, and I was just sat there and open, as it were, for people to be able to come in and have a chat. I thought that was kind of the right thing to do, and some people came in, but it was probably always the usual suspects that came in who weren't frightened, as it were. They didn't have any reason not to come and talk to me. But through that, I managed to open up some conversation, but there's definitely a risk of doing it that way. That triad type thing, that idea of getting three peers effectively to chat to each other, that conversation is likely to be a lot more open. And you're not asking people with those sort of things to, as it were, back to the courtroom, grass anyone up. But if we find out something curious about a project because of that conversation, then we do infer a duty on that triad to tell someone about it, because otherwise we miss an opportunity for some value, I suppose, unless we do that sort of thing. Kind of another long answer to your point, Andy, but I think that's my point about layers. Sorry, and that's the reason I say that. If you just relied on what everybody told the CIO, you're not going to get a good view. But if you've got some of these other layers in your detector array as well, then in the end, you're only ever getting a version of the truth, but you'll get something.
I can see Steve Maxwell nodding his head, and I can see there's lots of stuff moving through the chat. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Steve to come forward, and perhaps, I know he's always got an insightful question, Steve, so we'll probably start with that from his perspective, but then he'll feel from everyone in the community as well. So you mentioned that there are 15 areas or 15 items that you kind of identify.
Yeah.
And I'm really fascinated to see where that goes eventually and what you come out with it of. But what would you give then for a kind of a little summary of what we discussed so far? What would you share with our tech leaders for them to be mindful of or aware of? Or maybe to start maybe directing their focus at?
Thank you. I think the invitation would be in two parts. So the first part is about that sort of analogy for organizations. If you think that what I've been talking about is rubbish, then Fine, super. No, no worries at all. It could well be. Based on everything that I've just been saying, I'm not in control of this anyway, so that's fine. But if you kind of go along with the idea that there are always going to be things in your organization that you can't see, then that gives you perhaps a slightly different paradigm to act from. So that's always that's sort of a maybe place rather than any kind of absolutes. Practically, perhaps there's two thoughts. One, I really would invite people to think about that detector array kind of an idea. If you maybe just to concrete one of the points in there for a second, that micro narratives thing I talked about earlier. I don't really even need to explain this, or hopefully I don't. But if we said that on a report somewhere we got told that such and such a disk array over here was 88% capacity. Great. Okay. It's just a number. It's a statistic that may or may not be above a threshold. But if we had that data, but we also had some short sentence information around that. So we had someone from finance telling us that we're fighting with the vendor and no orders are going through for storage right now. We've got someone else who thinks there's some old data that could be archived and removed from that platform. And let's say someone else might end up taking some time off sick because they're so frightened of the thing breaking and how much time they had to put into it last time. Just those three stories suddenly create a very different picture and maybe a different impetus to action. So if you can capture that sort of stuff in there, then that's really useful. Also in that detector array, while I'm there, sorry, I keep talking about authors, but recommend Hubbard as well. Oh God, Douglas Hubbard? I think it's Douglas Hubbard. I might have to come back and share later. But he talks about how to measure things, or he's got a book effectively about measurement. When we think about measurement, teams will struggle with measuring things that are less tangible. But he invited, or his core idea, I suppose, was about using proxies for things. So he had a famous example of how much does my dog love me? And then asked an audience to say, well, how would we know? And you come up with all sorts of proxies for that. They're not going to be perfect, of course, but it gives you something that you may be able to look at. So another sort of layer in the array. A final point maybe is the idea that what I'm talking about, there's something, I haven't said it out loud, so just make sure it's explicit. I'm not suggesting that one person has their eyes on this detector, as it were. This is something where if we can somehow encourage and create the space where everyone's got a pair of binoculars and is able to talk about what they see, then we're clearly going to have more chance of seeing things, or more chance of discovering things than we would if we just kept the binoculars locked up, as apparently that they did on the Titanic, by the way. The binoculars that many of the crew needed were locked away. And anyway, the guy that had the key was asleep. So that's not great. But I would think in there, if you broadly accept the idea I'm talking about the paradigm, then maybe on a project you've got or something like that, then that's a good place to just have a play with. How can I get some information that's not the ice on the top of this thing, or not the visible universe, but rather how would I know if things are going in the wrong direction? What would tell me? And see where you go.
So I guess everybody contributes to the culture, and the culture itself is kind of invisible other than what we can observe as behaviors inside of that thing called a culture. But we're all part of it. We're all responsible for developing it, and we all play a part in developing it. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know you were trying to use that. That was a nice concluding sentence. Just to mix it up a little bit, we can't, to be true to what I talked about at the start about how what brought us to this point affects our behavior and so on. We're not going to be able to legislate for how that works. Things like psychological safety, for example, that often gets described as being something a leader tries to influence for their team. But that we all have experienced that kind of sentiment goes in many different directions. I've met plenty of leaders who had problems with psychological safety to their team, as it were. They wouldn't share things because they were worried about how it would look for them that way. So the picture is always more complex than perhaps we might give it credit for.
Stephen, thank you so much. a very complex subject, but I kind of got the thread and I know where we're going with it. So I'm going to invite Steve to come forward now, Steve Maxwell, because I'm fairly sure he'll be able to field some more insights from the community. So Stephen, so far, thank you so much. And Steve Maxwell, over to you, buddy.
Thank you, Andy.